This video is brought to you in part by Omniatlas, specifically the excellent political maps. I've been working behind the scenes with Omniatlas since 2013, twice as long as I've been working on this channel, and there's a reason. Omniatlas doesn't just show you official boundaries, but does its very best to display political control on the ground at any given date. My videos wouldn't be complete without access to their maps and map templates, so do yourself a favor and check them out through the link in the description below. For all his importance, Vladimir Lenin's rule over the Soviet Union was incredibly short-lived. He'd held power since 1917, but the Union didn't form until 1922, by which time he'd been ill for years. Lenin was the premier, or prime minister, and for a long time his most obvious successor seemed to be Leon Trotsky, the People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, the founder of the Red Army, and probably the most famous living communist other than Lenin himself. But by the formation of the Union, that wasn't so clear. In September 1922, Lenin had asked Trotsky to serve as one of his deputies, but Trotsky turned him down in protest of the new economic policy, later forming the left opposition. At the same time, Deputy Alexei Rykov joined with Nikolai Bukharin, editor of the party newspaper Pravda, on the right wing of the Communist Party. Even in a one-party state, factions are inevitable. When Lenin died in January 1924, Rykov succeeded him as premier, but real power was gathering elsewhere. Raised in poverty by a single mother in Georgia, Yosef Djugashvili initially trained to become a priest before dropping out of the seminary in 1899 to join the precursor to the Communist Party. When the party began splintering between Lenin's Bolsheviks and Yuli Martov's Mensheviks, Georgian members overwhelmingly sided with the Mensheviks, but not Djugashvili, who went on to raise money for the Bolsheviks through robbery, extortion, and kidnapping. Because of this, there's always been a tendency to write him off as a dumb thug, but I disagree. He certainly wasn't an intellectual, but very few sociopaths are able to navigate the social complexities of politics as he did, especially coming from such a humble background. In 1907, while the Mensheviks dominated the party, Djugashvili was briefly expelled due to his leadership of a notorious bank robbery in the Georgian capital Tiflis, which killed 40 people and provoked a severe backlash from socialist parties around the world. But the Bolsheviks ignored this decision, and he remained a key player through imprisonment and exile. Hiding out in Vienna under the pseudonym Stalin, he published his only significant piece of theory, Marxism and the National Question. In the Russian Empire, as in much of the world, socialist movements had attracted disproportionate attention from minority groups who tended to live in cities and suffered political disadvantages on the basis of ethnicity as well as class. By 1913, when Stalin was writing, new movements had already sprung up seeking to reconcile the Marxist struggle with minority rights and cultural autonomy. As part of a minority group himself, you'd think Stalin would be sympathetic to these views, but he largely wasn't. He conceptualized a nation as a community sharing a common land, language, economy, and national identity. By extension, any group failing to meet those requirements wasn't worthy of consideration, with Jews as a prime example. As for those groups Stalin did consider nations, the bourgeois roots of their nationalist movements were contrary to the class struggle. Though he demonized the Jewish Bund, he wasn't much kinder to his native Caucasus, arguing passionately in favor of regional self-government but against cultural autonomy. On this basis, Lenin appointed Stalin as People's Commissar for Nationalities following the October Revolution. Apparently softening his position, this included a Jewish commissariat, Evcom, which purged non-communist Jewish institutions, oversaw the standardization of the Yiddish language, and helped implement government services in Yiddish before the Constitution of 1924 abolished the Nationality Commissariat. In the meantime, Lenin lobbied for Stalin's appointment as General Secretary of the Communist Party, a decision he soon came to regret. This wasn't technically a government role, and in a democracy it would hardly be important. But in a single-party state, controlling when and where the party meets and who meets with whom had the potential to become the most powerful job in the country, promoting loyalists, undermining rivals, and establishing a personal power base. In 1923, Stalin ignored an order from Lenin to send money to his old rival Martov as he lay dying of tuberculosis in Germany. And around the same time, a series of letters, apparently dictated by Lenin, appeared indicating that he had lost faith in Stalin due to his rudeness, increasingly racist outlook, and hunger for power. These letters suggested removing Stalin as general secretary, but he was able to save himself, ironically, by offering to resign. Not realizing the true power Stalin wielded, the main worry for Deputy Premier Lev Kamenev and Communist International Chairman Grigory Zinoviev was that Trotsky would use his popularity to force his way into power. By comparison, Stalin seemed dull, unassuming, and above all loyal to Lenin, even arranging his funeral. He'd positioned himself as a moderate who could help Kamenev and Zinoviev, so while Rykov succeeded Lenin as premier, true power rested with the Troika. Lauding the continuation of the new economic policy, Nikolai Bukharin became one of Stalin's key allies. For those unfamiliar, the NEP was a program of limited economic liberalization meant to establish a stable money supply, facilitate foreign trade, rebuild industry, and win the loyalty of the peasants who still made up the majority of the Union's population. Under Bukharin's influence, Stalin extended this idea into the realm of foreign policy. Back in the 19th century, Karl Marx had envisioned socialist revolutions in industrialized Western countries, and Lenin had encouraged Marxists abroad to rise up with help from the Communist International. But those uprisings had all failed, leading Bukharin, and now Stalin, to question the supposed necessity of exporting the revolution, let alone whether it was worth antagonizing the rest of the world to do so. Though not abandoning the goal of global transformation, they argued that the Union could construct a socialist society by its own internal resources, pursuing a breathing space of trade and diplomatic relations while still helping establish foundations for communism abroad. Their conclusion was called Socialism in One Country, and it reshaped the political landscape almost overnight. In September 1925, Kamenev and Zinoviev broke with Stalin and called for his removal as general secretary. The attacks weren't just from the left either. Joining Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Lenin's widow Nadezhda Krupskaya was Finance Minister Grigory Sokolnikov, a close ally of Bukharin who supported Stalin's economic plans but opposed his consolidation of power. For a moment, it seemed like Stalin's reign would soon end, but at the 14th Party Congress, Stalin inveighed against his former allies for encouraging factionalism and strengthening non-communist elements within the country. It had only been 3 years since the Civil War. Though the enemies of the Red Army were defeated militarily, anti-communist sympathy was still widespread. And while Stalin may have lost some favor with the other founding fathers, he just spent 2 years stacking the party bureaucracy with newcomers who owed their positions to him. So it was an easy sell. Socialism in one country was adopted, and Stalin's position was secured. Realizing their dire situation, Kamenev and Zinoviev joined forces with Trotsky as the united opposition. Back on the Soviet street, Jewish life had settled into a certain equilibrium. According to the 1926 census, the Union was home to the third largest Jewish population in the world. The project to standardize Soviet Yiddish continued from its de facto headquarters in Minsk, with new Yiddish law courts and state-supported Yiddish theater. Many Jewish business owners had fled the country after losing their property and political rights through the new economic policy, but many Jewish workers took advantage of the opportunities created by their absence. Synagogues, like churches, mosques, and temples, continued to exist, but in fewer numbers, less visually prominent places, and under policies that discouraged formal membership. Some independent organizations continued underground, but they were eventually uncovered and purged, culminating in the 1927 arrest, trial, and exile of the Chabad Rebbe Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. At a time when religiosity was already in decline, these measures initially received little pushback, but secularization became more contentious as the decade drew to a close. There were also subtle changes in policy, and at this point it's probably worth examining Stalin's personal anti-Semitism. Stalin didn't hate Jews in the same way as the Nazis or Imperial Russia's Black Hundred. He didn't think they were inherently evil or racially inferior, but he clearly held the idea of Jewish culture in contempt, and viewed almost any attempt to institutionalize that culture as hostile, especially Zionism and Bundism. As the years progressed, this paranoia towards Jewish interest politics would fuel a suspicion of Jews in general, but his inner circle still included a handful of Jewish allies. For a brief time, he even tolerated an experiment in the creation of a new Jewish homeland. While the new economic policy created opportunities for a new class of small business owners, it also created a huge population of former business owners known as lichenzi, who were barred from voting, attending universities, obtaining health insurance, or joining trade unions. As the NEP went on, this became a bigger and bigger problem, as the flight of lichenzi from the country created a brain drain while those who remained struggled with long-term unemployment. This included a large share of the Jewish population, so the Jewish section of the Communist Party, the Evsektia, began exploring the possibility of resettling Jewish lichenzi as farmers. Meanwhile, Stalin's dismissal of Jewish nationhood was primarily based on the fact that they lacked a common homeland or language. Even within the Soviet Union, they were mostly scattered across the southern and western fringe with 4 native languages. They had once constituted the majority in a number of cities, but with rapid industrialization attracting so many former peasants from the countryside, that was no longer the case. Of course, there was already a movement outside the Soviet Union working to establish a Jewish land and language, but Zionists had been banished from the Communist International long ago. Even the anti-Zionist Palestine Communist Party was on thin ice due to their failure to attract Arab workers. And of course, Stalin was petrified of Bundism, or at least what he imagined Bundism to be. In truth, the Evsektia had co-opted and largely implemented the most important parts of the Bund's platform. But Stalin didn't know that, so to him, a Jewish agricultural region carried the additional perk of undermining the Bundist and Zionist underground. Thus, the Evsektia's push for Jewish agriculture became an exercise in nation-building through the public outreach group Ozet. Due to disagreements over where the proposed homeland should be, Ozet initially prepared for 2 Jewish colonies, one in Crimea and another on the Chinese border, centered around the new city of Birobidzhan. The Crimean proposal was roundly rejected by local farmers and politicians, so Birobidzhan it was. The conditions weren't forgiving, but with enough time, it could have succeeded. In 1933, membership in Ozet peaked at 500,000, and in 1934, the area around Birobidzhan was designated as the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, with Yiddish as the official language and the promise of elevation to a full republic once Jews comprised the majority of the population. But that never happened. By 1934, the balance of power in Moscow had shifted wildly. Many of those who'd supported the project were no longer in a position to do so. The Evsektia itself had dissolved in 1930, and Stalin's policies toward minorities had become less forgiving. In 1926, Soviet intelligence obtained a summary of British war games simulating an invasion of the Soviet Union alongside Poland. This wasn't a credible threat. Every major power was doing war games like these in the 1920s, but when the British realized that the Soviets were using their trade bureau in London for espionage, they raided it and shut it down, suspending diplomatic relations and convincing Stalin that the simulation was real. At the same time, the opposition grew louder, with Trotsky leading the call to democratize the party, move away from socialism in one country, and replace the NEP with rapid, centrally planned industrialization. Soon after, Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev were expelled from the party, ending the united opposition. Around the same time, a disappointing harvest convinced Stalin that the NEP wasn't preparing the country to withstand a major crisis, accusing affluent farmers known as kulaks of stockpiling grain in preparation to collaborate with Britain and Poland in the supposed invasion. Instead, he initiated the first 5-year plan, phasing out the mixed economy in favor of state-run industrialization driven by resumed collectivization of farms to eliminate the kulaks. Ironically, this overlapped a lot with Trotsky's platform, and it horrified Bukharin and Rykov. Stalin's allies on the right feared that embarking on forced collectivization now was logistically impossible, and that an end to the NEP would discourage foreign investment and further isolate the country diplomatically. These fears only deepened when Stalin denounced European Social Democrats as social fascists, precluding any cooperation with them in the fight against actual fascists. By the end of 1928, the effects were already clear. Lagging construction resulted in a housing shortage, the consumer economy withered, and despite nationalizing grain collection, food prices soared, necessitating rationing. Bukharin wasn't afraid to criticize Stalin even as he remained in government, but most of the Politburo deferred to Stalin, who expelled Bukharin and removed him as editor of Pravda. Stalin's moves didn't go ignored by the wider public. By spring 1929, Trotsky had been forced into exile, but his allies and supporters continued protesting in the lead-up to that year's elections, as did peasant unions and even several Christian groups. Though the Soviet Union had elections, candidates were subject to approval by the Communist Party, whether they were actual party members, independents, or members of the communist youth movement Komsomol. At the time, elections were held in public meetings with voters merely given the choice of either approving or denying a pre-selected list of candidates. So in the lead-up to the 1929 election, opposition groups fielded shadow candidates, reminding voters of the choice they weren't given. Turnout plummeted, and there was even some violence against party officials. But if anything, this convinced Stalin to double down. In June 1929, the Politburo established what came to be known as the Main Directorate for Correctional Labor Camps, or Gulag, a vast network of prisons using political enemies as slave labor for the Union's industrialization. Premier Rykov was denounced and removed in favor of Vyacheslav Molotov, leading a new wave of Stalin loyalists in the cabinet, including 3 Jews. Additionally, Stalin promoted Jewish functionary Lazar Kaganovich as Deputy General Secretary, but as always, these were his Jews. He obviously had no compunctions about dismissing Jewish opponents, let alone the anonymous masses. The threat of war, even imagined, had convinced him to regard cultural difference as an enemy. In December 1929, Stalin intensified the campaign against the kulaks, declaring that not only would their farms be collectivized, but that they wouldn't be allowed to farm at all. In many cases, they were simply killed. Beginning the next year, the secret police known as the OGPU instituted impossibly high quotas and seized so much grain that Stalin himself noticed pockets of starvation while visiting Georgia. By 1932, the famine had spread to the rest of the Caucasus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. As the threat of starvation grew, peasants focused their resources on pure survival, while the shortage of feed for draft animals and long-term soil depletion made it harder to grow crops in the first place. Authorities in Moscow and Kiev ignored these knock-on effects, arresting peasants in the tens of thousands and in many cases liquidating many of the farms they'd already collectivized. By the year's end, the government's reaction had taken on a distinctly ethnic character. Due to demographic factors predating communist rule, farmers in the affected areas were disproportionately Ukrainian, including Ukrainian colonists in southern Russia and Kazakhstan. And Stalin's allies were quick to accuse the Ukrainian peasantry of sabotaging the harvest in preparation for a nationalist uprising, which the OGP used to justify further arrests and confiscations. In early 1933, Moscow forbade any government body from recording starvation-related deaths other than the OGPU. As desperate Ukrainians fled to other parts of the Union, Moscow banned refugees from leaving and banned citizens elsewhere from bringing food into Ukraine. Even cities, which were typically more resistant to famine, became subject to mass starvation. Today, this is known as the Holodomor and is widely regarded as a genocide. By the end of 1933, between 3 and 5 million people had died of starvation. And though the famine may have originated from natural causes, its length and scale were entirely man-made. It's worth noting that the famine didn't end because of a bigger harvest, but because the government lowered its quotas. In the West, the ongoing Great Depression had inspired a number of communists abroad to immigrate to the Soviet Union, only for them to report the horrors of the famine back to their native countries. This in turn compelled Ukrainian communities in the US to demand action from Washington, but no help was coming. At the height of the atrocities, the administration of President Franklin Roosevelt was negotiating with Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov to recognize the Soviet Union in order to open trade and stimulate the US economy. There's a long paper trail showing that American diplomats in Eastern Europe were aware of what was going on in Ukraine and sympathetic to the plight of the Ukrainian people, but the White House remained silent. Nevertheless, a handful of foreign journalists in the Union continued reporting on it, including Jewish American Eugene Lyons. Initially a communist sympathizer, Lyons was one of the first Westerners to interview Stalin, only to become disillusioned by the horrors he witnessed in Ukraine, alongside the fervent denials and justifications in Pravda. But others remained under Stalin's spell, and while they couldn't prevent their peers from revealing the truth, they could sow doubt in their credibility. This was the method employed by Louis Fisher of The Nation. A volunteer for the Jewish Legion in the First World War, Fischer's disillusionment with Zionism drove him into the arms of the Communist International, later serving as the nation's Moscow correspondent. Like Lyons, Fischer was initially disturbed by the poor harvest in Ukraine and criticized the government's efforts to seize more, but by 1933 he'd thoroughly sided with Moscow, insisting that any repressions in Ukraine were provoked, that there was no famine, and that even if there was, these were just the growing pains of an industrializing state, and the death toll reported by his colleagues was impossible. If someone had said these things in Pravda or the Daily Worker in the US, it would be written off automatically. But Fischer's position at a left-leaning but non-communist magazine helped bolster his credibility, just as it did for other denialists in the mainstream press. He also benefited from the fact that some of the most outspoken coverage of the Holodomor came from opponents of normalization. So despite overwhelming evidence, propagandists like Fischer turned the matter into a game of he said, she said. In a way, he was a victim of the same propaganda that he wrote. Whatever his personal doubts, he was still willing to believe that the Soviet experiment was an inherently moral force, and moral forces don't commit genocide. In 2010, a Ukrainian court posthumously indicted 7 high-ranking officials for their role in the Holodomor. And it's notable that this list includes members of the same groups targeted by the famine. Stalin could always make exceptions for those he believed to be loyal, at least in the moment, but the nameless masses always haunted him. If the Holodomor ended after 1933, it was only because he no longer viewed the Ukrainians as a threat. Who was next? On a spring day in 1934, 2 Jewish writers ran into each other on the streets of Moscow. Brash and overdressed as always, Osip Mandelstam asked his friend for his opinion on a new poem.
We live death to the lamp beneath us. 10 steps away, no one hears our speeches. But when there's so much as half conversation, the Kremlin man of the mountains will be mentioned. His fingers are as fat as grubs, and the words final as lead weights fall from his lips. His cockroach whiskers leer as his boot tops gleam. Around him a rabble of thin-necked leaders, fawning half-men with him to play with, deny and purn wine as he prates and points his finger. One by one forging his laws to be flung like horseshoes at the head, the eye, and the groin. And every killing is a treat for the broad-chested Ossete.
The other man was shocked. Boris Pasternak, who'd once worked under Stalin and called him the most terrifying person he'd ever met, responded,
I didn't hear this. You didn't recite it to me. Because, very strange and terrible things are happening now. They've begun to pick people up. I'm afraid the walls have ears, and perhaps even these benches on the boulevard here may be able to listen and tell tales. So let's make out that I heard nothing.
It was too late. Mandelstam was arrested by the OGPU 2 weeks later on direct orders from its new boss, Genrikh Yagoda. The phone rang at Pasternak's apartment. Picking up, he was greeted by the voice of Stalin himself, wanting to know what he thought of his counter-revolutionary friend. Pasternak tried to distance himself, but Stalin didn't buy it for a second, mocking him for selling out a peer. During the Holodomor, Stalin's wife Nadezhda Alliluyeva fled their abusive marriage and committed suicide. She was one of very few people whom Stalin would allow to disagree with him, and without her, the echo chamber he'd constructed around himself intensified, as did his paranoia. Around that time, he rolled out a second 5-year plan to catch up to Western industry, collectivize all agriculture, eradicate all private business, and liquidate all religious institutions. It was really more of a wish list than a plan, but still a useful window into his intentions. Now, with the campaign against the Ukrainians concluded, Stalin turned his attention to sectors of society which he considered uniquely susceptible to quartering disloyalty, including, but not limited to, the arts, immigrants and refugees, small towns and villages, latecomers to the party, opposition figures within the party, and the officer ranks of the military. Stalin wasn't inherently opposed to these sectors. His love of music, film, poetry, and architecture are well documented, and actually skewed pretty traditional. But even the artists he loved feared him, always aware that an innocuous creative choice could end their careers, their freedom, or even their lives. Declaring his intentions at the 17th Party Congress in Moscow, former opponents responded with terrified applause. But it wouldn't save them. In July, the OGPU reorganized into the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, or NKVD, with Yagoda elevated to Interior Minister. At first, this was viewed as an act of moderation, as many of the Union's earliest and most zealous agents retired and many political prisoners from the 1920s were released. But that feeling came to an end in December, when Leningrad Party boss Sergei Kirov was assassinated. Kirov was Stalin's closest friend, and, like his late wife, one of the few people who could speak honestly without fearing for his safety. The assassin, Leonid Nikolaev, was an unemployed party reject whose grievances against Kirov seemed to have been personal, and material evidence indicates that he acted alone. But while investigating the murder, Yagoda's deputy Yakov Agranov discovered that Nikolaev had once aligned himself with the United Opposition, which, though officially dissolved, had remained in contact with Trotsky in exile. They barely existed at this point, but Stalin wasn't going to miss the opportunity afforded by his friend's murder. So he gave the NKVD power to act independently of the courts and swiftly had Zinoviev and Kamenev arrested. Before his capture, Zinoviev expressed fear that Stalin was about to undertake something like the Night of the Long Knives, Adolf Hitler's purge of the Nazi Party paramilitary and anti-Nazi right, which had taken place 5 months earlier. Oh, Greg, you'll wish this was the Night of the Long Knives. Nearly 2 years later, in the trial of the 16, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and 9 others were charged, convicted, and executed for alleged involvement in the murder of Kirov and an alleged conspiracy with Trotsky to murder Stalin, Kaganovich, and several other high-ranking officials. Alongside them, 5 German communists were convicted and executed for their supposed role as a Trotskyist sleeper cell. Of the 16 defendants, 9 were Jewish, including all the Germans. And without putting too fine a point on it, this would be a recurring pattern. Minorities and the foreign-born had always made up a disproportionate share of the communist vanguard, but of that vanguard, Stalin's repressions targeted minorities even more disproportionately. The true blossoming of his anti-Semitism was still a decade away, but it would still feature prominently in what came to be known as the Great Purge. This wasn't merely an attack against Stalin's left, nor was it limited to politicians. By allowing the NKVD to operate independently, he'd given himself a license to go after any perceived threat at any level of society. No sector of the population was immune, though some were targeted more than others. On the Jewish street, the purge arguably began back in April 1934, when a Hasidic butcher in Minsk named Yankev Tevye Rapoport was accused of molesting 12 girls in his community. Though Rapoport wasn't a rabbi, his position gave him a degree of religious authority. Butchers were traditionally among the only men in Jewish Orthodoxy allowed to be alone in private with women who weren't family. And given what we now know about the potential for sexual abuse in insular religious communities, I think the accusations are entirely plausible. But the prosecutors in Rapoport's trial, whom I should note were also Jewish, were less interested in convicting him than in using the case to launch a propaganda campaign equating religiosity with sexual deviance as part of Stalin's wider anti-religious program. In both cases, they succeeded. Rapoport was convicted, and sales of kosher meat plummeted. By contrast, the purge of Zionists was discreet. As far as Stalin was concerned, Zionism had already been purged. If they were making waves in another part of the world, that was someone else's problem. And if a Zionist underground still existed within the Union, it was only spillover from neighboring countries where the movement operated freely. You can debate whether being a Zionist should have been a crime, but indictments for Zionism tended to be credible. Bundism, with its emphasis on cultural autonomy unbound by geography, offered a more tangible threat. It was also harder to disprove. Unlike Zionists, whose guilt was ascertained by their involvement with specific organizations, there was no organized Bundist underground. But the former Yevsektia had been full of ex-Bundists, and Lenin's nativization program had significant overlap with the Bund's original goals. So if you were a Bundist under the Empire and joined the Communist Party after the Civil War, you were guilty until proven innocent. Beyond the generic charge of counter-revolutionary activity, the rationale varied. First, ex-Bundists were charged with undermining the project for a Jewish homeland in the Far East. Later, they were accused of supporting Trotsky. The reality is that the NKVD had arrest quotas to meet, and Yiddish culture was an easy target. Citizens who struggled or failed to denounce supposedly counter-revolutionary friends and family were picked up themselves, and the vicious cycle continued. Yiddish itself wasn't in danger. Books, plays, and even films in Yiddish continued to be produced, but certain institutions were made to suffer for their past associations. In 1936, Yiddish was delisted as one of Belarus's official languages. In 1938, all Yiddish language schools were shut down, and in 1939, the last nationwide Yiddish newspaper ceased publication. Supporters of the Purge admonished the Jewish community to count their blessings. In Germany, the Nazis had come to power on an anti-Semitic platform and pushed through countless anti-Semitic laws. In Poland, the power vacuum created by the death of Marshal Józef Piłsudski had resulted in an explosion of anti-Jewish discrimination and violence, culminating in the dictatorship of Ozan. Newspapers and educational materials were quick to laud Soviet Jews' contributions to the fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War. If all else failed, they could remind Jews of their persecution under the Russian Empire, and though they would never have framed it this way, however disproportionately Jews were targeted in the Purge, the Union's German, Polish, and Latvian populations had it much worse. So tonight, thank Comrade Stalin it's them instead of you. For a brief moment, things seemed to calm down. In late 1936, Stalin oversaw the creation of a new constitution, with 5 new states, reformed elections, and a bicameral Supreme Soviet. Lishentsy status was abolished, giving all citizens equal political and economic rights, and in a shocking reversal of the second 5-year plan, Stalin fought to include language guaranteeing religious freedom. The Constitution did formalize the supremacy of the Communist Party, but that just confirmed the reality on the ground. In the months that followed, Yagoda reported that the trial of the 16 had been unpopular with the general public, which might have been true, but we'll never know, and it didn't matter. Knowing Yagoda to be a former ally of Bukharin and the rightists, Stalin interpreted his caution as an act of sabotage, firing him from the NKVD and resuming the purge with even greater intensity. By torturing the original 16 defendants, the NKVD obtained justification to arrest 17 more opposition members, including former finance minister Grigory Sokolnikov and Karl Radek. Born in what was now Poland, Radek had worked directly under Trotsky during the Civil War before serving as a fixer for the Communist International, assisting 2 failed uprisings in Germany and playing a minor role in the drafting of the new constitution. 15 of the 17 defendants were promptly executed, but Radek and Sokolnikov were spared, as they had been tortured into accusing several of Stalin's other rivals. The accusations were pretty absurd. Sokolnikov claimed that Trotsky was conspiring with the Nazis to invade, and both he and Radek accused Bukharin of trying to restore full-blown capitalism. For this, they were merely sentenced to hard labor in the gulags, but just 2 years later, Stalin had them assassinated. Bukharin and Yagoda were swiftly arrested, though the exact charges had yet to be determined. In the meantime, Stalin took aim at a supposed Trotskyist conspiracy in the military, with former Army Chief of Staff Mikhail Tukhachevsky as the ringleader. Of the 9 generals accused, 3 were Jewish. Commissar Jan Gamarnik committed suicide days before the trial, while Generals Yona Yakir and Boris Feldman were executed with the others on the 12th of June. In March 1938, Bukharin and Yagoda finally went on trial alongside former Premier Rykov, former Trade Minister Rosengoltz, and 17 other politicians, bureaucrats, and doctors for the supposed murders of 2 politicians and the poet Maxim Gorky. There's no indication that any of these men were even murdered, but who cared? 3 minor defendants were sent to the gulags, but the rest were executed, and the right opposition was no more. Of course, these were only the most prominent trials and executions. Depending on how you count, the Great Purge took between 600,000 and 2 million lives. Most were worked to death in the gulags. A sizable minority were executed in show trials or assassinated, and others simply disappeared, their fates lost to history. I think it's worth revisiting some familiar names. Mikhail Liber, sometimes known as Mark Liber, had been a founding member of the Jewish Bund in the 1890s. Others like him fled or joined the Yevsektia, but Liber stayed and continued to voice his criticisms. For a long time, the Kremlin regarded him as a harmless crank, but in March 1937, he was arrested by the NKVD and never seen again. As Minister of Agriculture during the Holodomor, Yakov Yakovlev exacerbated the famine due to his rejection of genetics and promotion of a pro-Stalin pseudoscience called Lysenkoism. Like Trotsky, he was improbably accused of collaborating with Nazi Germany and executed for treason. As deputy chief of the NKVD in 1934, Yakov Agranov played a key role in the investigation that created pretext for the Purge, as well as several of the ensuing show trials. He was then accused of supporting Trotsky and executed for treason. Semyon Dimanstein had been the original leader of the Yevsektia, where he oversaw Yiddish-language propaganda, purged non-communist Jewish organizations, and championed the creation of the autonomous Oblast in Birobidzhan. A critic of the Holodomor and the end of indigenization, he was arrested for terrorism and executed. In 1919, Bela Kun led a communist revolution in Hungary, only to be crushed by an alliance of nationalists. After several years' exile in Austria, he fled to Moscow, where he led the Hungarian communists in exile. As a former ally of Zinoviev, Kun was arrested as a Trotskyist and executed in secret. After his first arrest, Osip Mandelstam was exiled to Voronezh and given a chance of rehabilitation, but in 1937 the Writers' Union denounced him as a Bukharinist. He was sent to a gulag in the Far East and died of typhoid fever in December 1938. For several days, his fellow detainees hid his body in order to get his food ration. He was defiant to the last, even in death. Following the initial purge of military leaders, Semyon Gendin became acting head of the Foreign Intelligence Agency, the GRU, only to be arrested in a second wave of purges and executed in early 1939. A decorated officer who'd served the GRU in China and the US, Manfred Stern rose to mainstream fame as a general in the Spanish Civil War, fighting under the alias Emilio Kleber and celebrated as the savior of Madrid. Returning to Moscow at the war's end, he was arrested for counter-revolutionary activity and sent to the gulags, where he later died of exhaustion. One of the Union's most celebrated authors, playwrights, and journalists, Isaac Babel had privately denounced the Holodomor and spent much of the 1930s in France. As a result, he was arrested as a French spy, tortured into accusing other artists and entertainers, and executed in early 1940. Theater director Vsevolod Meyerhold was once hailed as part of the Soviet avant-garde, but in the years since, Stalin had condemned the avant-garde in favor of Soviet realism. Denounced as bourgeois, mediocre, and promoting laziness, Meyerhold was executed by firing squad. After fleeing the Union in 1929, Leon Trotsky fled first to Turkey, then France, then Norway, and finally Mexico. Continually denouncing Stalin's repressions, he attempted to form an alternative communist international, but it never gained much traction. In August 1940, suffering from poor health and the death of his eldest son, he was ambushed in his study by NKVD agent Ramon Mercader, who stabbed him in the brain with an ice pick. Trotsky died of shock in a nearby hospital the next day. Despite 6 years of terror and at least 600,000 dead, some managed to evade Stalin's machinations. After stepping down from the Soviet Central Bank, Bukharin ally Aron Shainman was reassigned to the London office of the Soviet travel agency Intourist. He was recalled to Moscow in 1939, but knowing what awaited him, he applied for British citizenship and was allowed to stay. As head of the NKVD office in Spain, Alexander Orlov spent the Spanish Civil War vetting foreign volunteers for the international brigades. Orlov was no fool, and when the brigades withdrew, he blackmailed the Kremlin, threatening to expose the GRU's operations in North America, and spent the rest of his life in the US. By the end of the Purge, only a handful of Jewish politicians remained in Stalin's good graces. As one of the Purge's primary architects, Lazar Kaganovich was promoted to deputy premier, where he'd remain for the rest of Stalin's life. Stalin's feelings for Maxim Litvinov were similarly warm, but by mid-1939, he pressured Litvinov to step down as foreign minister, as his Jewishness and accompanying opposition to Nazi Germany had become Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Dr. Chike, Andrew Ettinger, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Adam Kershaw, Sol Cohn, Milk and Honey, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.